I'm so stoked to be here in my my home playing field of Etsy. I'm also really excited to be part of the first Women Who Code event in New York City. This is pretty much the coolest thing. We're talking about designing for performance. All of these slides are at laraswanson.com/design, and all of the links that we're about to go through are also there. And I just tweeted this from @LaraSwanson, so feel free to check that out. We're going to cover markup optimizations, image optimizations, and tons of other things you can do to improve your front-end performance. So as Stella mentioned, my name is Lara. I am formerly the mobile web engineering manager. Now I'm the performance engineering manager. I'm happy to tell you that awesome story another day. But on Etsy, as Rami mentioned, we do a lot of things to make things better for people around the world. We try to help encourage people to make awesome, unique, handcrafted goods and connect with one another. And so similarly, my team is responsible for helping make sure that all the product and feature teams who are shipping experiments make them as fast as humanly possible. So I want you to take a step back and think for a second. You're waiting for the bus, right? You're like sitting here, you're like waiting for the walk signal, you're just like pausing for a second. What do? I'm gonna guess you take out your phone. Maybe you check Twitter, maybe you check your email, maybe you, I don't know, do something really fast, text somebody. That is the amount of time that a user to your site can accomplish one thing. That's a very fast amount of time. What we're realizing is web performance is a huge part of sites' overall user experience. It's being factored into search engine results, and its effect on user behavior are being studied by major sites. We're finding that users expect things to load in under 2 seconds. In fact, I know it's horrible. After 3 seconds, up to 40% of your users are going to abandon your site. So think about how often you search for things on the web. How quick do you just close a tab and go on to the next thing if a site's taking too long for it to load for you? We've been studying this on Etsy. We recently found that if we added 160 kilobytes of page weight to a page, hidden images, wasn't even seen by the user, it triggered a 12% increase in bounce rate on mobile devices. That is insane, and it's being studied by plenty of other sites. DoubleClick found that adding just removing one redirect, improving things, increased click-through rates on mobile by 12%. So again, envision that bus. That is the time that a user has to complete a task on your site. Ask yourself if your site is fast enough for that user to accomplish that one thing they want to do. We're designing sites with increasingly rich content, gorgeous JavaScript, complex graphics, et cetera, et cetera. So we may optimize design and layout for mobile, but we don't always design for optimized page speed. Some responsibly designed sites are irresponsible with the amount of content that they load on mobile devices. So we're going to talk through this. I can assure you that fast page load time builds trust in your website. You'll get more returning visitors. You'll get more people choosing you over a competitor. You'll get more people trusting your brand. And good overall user experience yields a ton of good things for you and your site, and optimized page speed is a huge part of it. Who in here works closely with designers? Yeah, so remember that this is going to be a constant, debate's the wrong word, argument's the wrong word, discussion with the designers, and that's what we really want to talk about. You want to optimize for a balance of aesthetics and speed. So think about your most recent design that you either had to code or that you worked on. Here's just some good questions to ask yourself as you're designing. This is an old experiment that we had on Etsy. I wanted to ask this designer, what value does this large hero image have? Will these 3 font weights really help drive conversions? What metric are we hoping will improve with the rotating image carousel? Aesthetics absolutely contribute to overall conversion rate, just like performance does. That's why we should be thinking about this stuff at the design stage and then benchmarking it as we go. So, you're ready to do front-end performance. What kind of things should you be optimizing for? Who here has used web page test? Awesome, this is new to many of you. So web page test is my favorite thing on the entire world. You'll enter your website URL. You can choose a test location from around the world, and you can see the first view and a repeat view. It'll show you things like the total number of requests. This is a waterfall chart that will show you the overall timings for plenty of things. This is Etsy's homepage. You can see CSS assets, JPEGs, JavaScript files, et cetera, and how long things are taking to load. We also want to optimize for size of requests, which web page test will help you. In this case, we've got a variety of resources ranging from 8 kilobytes to 74 kilobytes. So we're going to make things as small as humanly possible. We're going to talk about image formatting and spriting. We're going to talk about cutting down font weights. I love semantic markup and repurposability, so we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to lastly cover deliberate asset loading. So why do I want to talk about images first? This is a chart from the HTTP archive, which goes and scans all of the major websites and categorizes all their web performance data. You should totally check it out and compare your site to its stats. In this case, images make up more than half of the average site's page weight. So it's a huge win for performance. Cover some ground rules about image file types. PNGs are perfect for when you need transparency or when there's few colors. Only use JPEGs when you need a ton of colors. They offer no transparency, but they're great for compression. Unless you're running a site that has lots of GIFs, I recommend you avoid these entirely because they're actually tremendously heavy. And most animations these days can be replaced with CSS3. So when you're choosing your PNG, PNG 8 and PNG 24 are your major options in Photoshop. PNG 8 will have a maximum of 256 colors. You'll have alpha transparency, and generally they'll result in a very small file size. Like GIFs, you can choose the total number of colors over here. It can be as few as 1 and as many as 256. PNG 24 is prettier transparency. It can accommodate tons of colors, but this naturally results in a larger file size. And then after you have your PNGs, you want to save them for the web, right? So you want to optimize them in Photoshop as much as possible. Test with different qualities. In this case, I'm playing with a JPEG. I'm playing with the quality slider to see how compressed can I make this image without sacrificing tons of quality. You want to find the happy medium. For most people, for most sites, 70, 80% is best practice. At Etsy, we're playing with this a lot. We can get down to 50% sometimes if we're scaling images down. So it's important to play with the file size of each image and see what's the right thing for you. And then afterward, run it through a lossless image compressor, something like ImageOptim, which is actually a piece of software you can download, or Smush It, which is a ridiculous name for a website. You can upload your image. It'll choose the best compression methods for that image and then give you an output image with no noticeable difference in quality, but significantly smaller file size. Sprites. With HTTP2, we don't have to worry about these, but we're not there yet. Sprites allow you to do a ton of, so this is a sprite, and that's a sprite, and that's a sprite, and that's a sprite. So all of these things are groups of icons saving us requests. Instead of having an individual image each time, you can actually have a bunch of them all together and have one request that you can cache. So in this case, in my old company where I worked, this was 10 slots that we rotated 26 thumbnails through, and we were like, let's just try it. Let's make a sprite out of these images and see what happens. It added 60 kilobytes to the total page weight, which sounds like a lot, but we cut page load time by 35% because of the amount of requests that we were saving. So think about this. We were like, I don't know if this is going to work, but let's just measure it and see what happens. It's really important as you go through performance stuff to just try things out and measure it. You can always revert. That's what Git is for. Just go ahead and measure things and see what the effect is, not just on total page weight and request size, but what happens with your visitors too. So when it comes to images, good questions to ask. How compressed can this image be? How many colors do I need? Do I need transparency? And can I sprite it? There's one other amazing tidbit about this that I'd like to share. There was a study that was done by some researchers that published a paper. They went through and took all of Amazon's images and reformatted them as compressed JPEGs. They found that this saved 20% of the energy it needed to render Amazon on a mobile device. So we're talking about battery life savings by optimizing images. On Facebook, it would have saved 30% of the energy needed to load that page on a mobile device. So you're not just saving page load time when you're optimizing images, you're optimizing for the entire user experience, which includes battery life. It's a pop quiz. What file type would you use for the backgrounds on these buttons? Shout it out. PNG? It's a trap. It's CSS3. I'm just kidding. I screwed all. I'm sorry. So CSS3 gradients are amazing. They can handle transparency just like PNGs do. They can be overlaid on a background color, so you could have like a white to transparent CSS3, and you can just put it on any kind of button anywhere. It eliminates an image request, and they're super easy to re-edit. You and I both know how much of a pain it is to go through and find that old sprite and try to reformat it or just like add or remove something to it and re-export it. With CSS3, it's much easier to re-edit. Again, on lauraswanson.com, what was this? Thank you. Design, that's what it was. I have too many URLs. You can see the CSS3 gradient editor, a link to it, and it'll give you all the exported images for, exported code rather, for all the CSS3 gradients. Makes it much easier. This is what the syntax looks like. We've got a fallback color for any browsers that don't support CSS3. Then you've got different vendor prefixes for different kinds of browsers that you support. And a lot of these will eventually be the W3C version, so you'll only need one in the future. So easy. They're amazing. All of these things on the screen were made with just CSS3. A hot tip, if you go to css3geometrydaily.com, or .tumblr.com rather, you can see all of these amazing geometrical things made with just CSS3. You should totally check it out. I will caution you that if you have a lot of repaints on a page, your page can become sluggish, so be careful with the amount of CSS3 you use, but try it and find out what's going to happen. So good questions to ask yourself about CSS3. Can any of my images be replaced with gradients? Can this gradient work over multiple background colors? And is there any UI sluggishness that could be triggered by repaint times? Still with me? We're going to talk about fonts, the bane of my existence. I have had more arguments with designers over the number of fonts that they've included, especially at Etsy. So I'm really, this is like a sticking point for me. So, I mean, who here has implemented web fonts on their site? You know. How many people have implemented more than 4 font weights on the same site? Oh, you're so lucky. I can't believe you got out of this. So here's the thing. Older versions of IE download all of the fonts that you include in your CSS file, regardless of whether or not they're actually implemented on the page. And this includes 9, 10, and 11 with compatibility mode turned on. So you should include as few fonts as humanly possible in your CSS file. You should only import the font weights you absolutely need. This has everything to do with optimizing the size and number of requests that it takes to load your page. Because the more font weights you use, the longer your page will take to load. Font files can be extraordinarily heavy. The average font served by Google Web Fonts is about 35 kilobytes, but they can be upwards of 200 kilobytes depending upon the language and character support. So you can make optimizations to them with character subsetting using tools like Font Squirrel's Font Generator, or if you use something like Google, it'll allow you to specify just the language or just the characters that you want to use on your website. Please do these things. So good questions to ask your designer when they inevitably try to add 8 different font weights to your page. Which font weights do I absolutely need in this design? Can any of these please be combined or consolidated? And can I remove some of the characters to decrease the total file size of these fonts? All right, we're hitting my personal favorite part, semantics and repurposability. I'm a huge Zeldman fan. Zeldman has that whole thing about semantics, semantics, semantics. I am so on board with this for performance reasons. The more repurposable you can make a design pattern, any kind of code, any kind of widget, the more that stuff can be cached and reused throughout your site. You're saving not just page load time, but development time. It will be so much easier for you to go through and re-edit these things as you go or make improvements across the site with just simple, semantic, repurposable design patterns. I once went through a template, and I just cleaned it up. I went through and I eliminated a divitis, which we'll get to in a second. I cleaned up all of the outdated language. I made it as semantic and repurposable as possible. And it had a huge effect on the total file size. You can't see, that's HTML, CSS, and my style sheet images. Before the cleanup is in blue, and after the cleanup is in green. This was not a redesign. This was purely just a cleanup effort. So you can see that they really trigger each other. The more you can clean up your HTML, the more you clean up your CSS, bloat leads to bloat. So as you're designing and developing, ask yourself, can someone else use this pattern? Because again, assets that get repurposed can be cached, which is a huge performance win. I recommend naming elements by function or content, not design. This is hotly debated in our industry, but it's my main recommendation for a small or medium-sized site. A site like Facebook that's that big should obviously use more object-oriented CSS naming patterns. But for your average site, being semantic with your element names can be hugely beneficial for both repurposability and eliminating unnecessary elements. go ahead and remove those inefficient selectors. So this is a class of wide, an ID of sidebar, and a link that's called search. Just call it search. Unless you absolutely need that weight, it's usually an indicator of some bad code written somewhere else. It used to be thought that inefficient selectors were inherently bad for performance. It was true. Browsers have gotten past this. It's not really a performance concern these days for purely efficiency reasons. But again, this is a pretty clear indicator that something else is wrong somewhere in your site. You should try to figure out why you need all of these different weights. And again, go through and remove as many unnecessary elements as possible. Divitis is when you have a div within a div within a div within a div within a div, and you probably don't need those divs. So please clean this up. I went through and did this. So this is a before and an after using Firefox's 3D viewer, which is super cool, and you should definitely go check it out. It'll show you the depth of your page. So before, you can see I had like all these links and like all of these divs, like a rotating thing and thumbnails, and it was like super deep. And they went through and made it just like 4 or 5 levels deep. It's a huge cleanup effort that didn't take that long, actually, because it's easy to see and spot things that you don't end up needing. And this is a huge performance win. So good questions to ask yourself about repurposability. Did I create a design pattern that can be repurposed? Did I use semantic element names and a good HTML hierarchy? And can my work be repurposed by someone else on another project? So all right, here's a little tricky question. Who here has worked on a responsive web design? You're right, everybody now, right? Like I did this talk like 2 years ago and it was nobody, and now it's literally everybody. I've heard people say that responsive web design is inherently bad for performance. It's not. People are just doing it wrong. It can be awesome and super performant. The reason why this is incredibly important is that people globally are using mobile devices as a primary internet access method. In the US, we're only at like 25% of people in the US are using the mobile devices as their primary internet access method. But globally, this is enormous. We're seeing people in Africa and Asia use their mobile devices permanently, basically. This included tablets in the desktop category. We're not even talking about tablets. This is all about handsets. And here's the other part about this that sucks. Mobile performance is terrible. So before a device can transmit or receive data, it has to establish a radio channel with the network, and this can take several seconds. The best part is if there's no data transmitted or received, after a timeout, that channel is going to go idle, which requires a new channel to be established. This can obviously wreak havoc on your page load times. We're seeing this in the average round trip it takes to go and get an asset. On desktop Wi-Fi, it takes like less than 50 milliseconds. On 3G, it can take upwards of 300 milliseconds, which is effectively as slow as old dial-up connections. But again, responsive web design doesn't have to be bad for performance. I recommend starting with a mobile-first workflow. If you start your design or development workflow by thinking about the project from a mobile perspective first, you may be able to avoid many of the problems that bloated responsive web designs face. Designing mobile first can save you time enforcing the big questions early, like what the core purpose of your page or site is, and trimming all of the other cruft thereafter. As you implement responsive, you will make choices about the content size as it's displayed to the user. It may be fluid, it may be fixed and changed at certain breakpoints, and you may choose to just not load certain assets. This is why it's important to make sure you are only loading the assets that you truly need for your users. There's a few ways to do this. One approach is to consider conditional loading. You may have heard the term REST, which is using responsive combined with server-side detection, which takes into account like the kind of device the user is, their screen size, touch capabilities, etc., and it loads only the content that's necessary for that user. So adaptive images, for example, detects the user's screen size and automatically creates, caches, and delivers device rescaled appropriate images from your web page's embedded HTML. You can also lazy load things. However, this can cause problems for screen readers and search bots and any users with JavaScript disabled, so I don't recommend that as much. But then the other part about this that's important is third-party scripts. I mean, they can be a single point of failure anyway for your website if they don't load, but equally important, if they do load, they can drag down the performance of your site. That's Google+. And for a while there, it was switching between the old PNG for Google+ and the new one, and they had both code jammed into the same little thing, and it was terrible for performance. And from left to right here, that's Twitter, Facebook-like, Google+, and the old Facebook sharing buttons. There's no reason why these things should load synchronously. Always load them asynchronously. If a third party doesn't provide an asynchronous version, demand it. I will back you up on this. Also, consider replacing these in responsive web design with just simple sharing buttons. You don't need to load an entire plugin just for a mobile device with somebody to share. Responsive images are another thing to consider. Picture fill is a technique that you can use to deliver correctly sized images to your users, and it mimics the proposed picture element, which is new and fancy and we should all check out. It only requires a tiny JavaScript file, and it works across all browsers. It looks like this. So you set the data source and the data media attributes for each image size. Performance-wise, this is awesome. It provides unique image URLs that can be cached, and it starts with the smallest image and requires only one image download for the user. And it even has a fallback for old IE browsers. The markup looks sizable, and so we're hoping that in the future this can be optimized and cached. But also responsive, everything else we already talked about, all the image stuff, all the font stuff, all the semantic stuff can also be applied to responsive. So knowing all those things, you may be asking yourself, am I responsible for performance? Is my manager responsible for performance? Is that designer responsible for performance? Maybe the very important people like your CEO, do I need like empowerment from those people to be doing performance at my company? I firmly believe that there should be no performance cops or performance janitors. It's just not sustainable. Performance is truly everyone's responsibility. Otherwise, you will be endlessly fighting an uphill battle. You need a culture of performance, and that's easy for me to say because we did it at Etsy. But changing culture is hard. It's probably the hardest part about doing performance right at your organization. We at Etsy, frankly, even still struggle with it, and we've had top-down management buy-in and a metrics-focused development cycle for years. I recommend helping people at your site feel what your users are feeling and experiencing when they browse your site. We're going to show you a video in a second, but have people compare a before and after to a performance improvement you made. So you have the site, you take a screenshot of it or run a video of it loading, make an improvement, and then compare the before and the after. Maybe have people see the difference between what it feels like to browse your site on mobile versus to browse your site on desktop. Maybe show them what it's like to load your page from Singapore. Maybe show you versus your competitor, like in this case. Is that running? Yeah. Come on, get it together, Google. So in this case, I can actually show a site using web page test. It allows you to export this video. And you can show your very important people, show your coworkers what it feels like to really browse your site. I also recommend sharing performance reports publicly. We've been doing this for about 3 years at Etsy. The man behind the sunglasses is Seth Walker, and he published Etsy's first performance report years ago on the Etsy News blog. He wanted to make Etsy accountable to the community for how fast our site was loading. So he chose basic performance metrics, and he published our first report. And our first report was actually pretty embarrassing. We had a lot of stuff that we needed to fix. Because we committed to a monthly weather report, it forced us to nail down repeatable and measurable goals as a baseline. We wanted to compare apples to apples, and it helped us prepare for the next month's work. A few folks at some monitoring companies who shall not be named reached out to us after we published this first report and said, yeah, that data that you published, that's about the same as we've been measuring for you too. So remember that performance is at least as important, if not more important, to your competitors, and they're likely already watching how fast your site is loading. And we actually killed parts of the site, features on the site, because developers saw how slow our site was and how much we needed to improve it. And they banded together with the performance team to make improvements based on this first weather report. It immediately started to see buy-in from development teams across the company, and we all started working together towards performance. And the side effect of all this is uncovering performance bugs that we wouldn't have otherwise seen. And we actively celebrate these kinds of wins internally. Seth actually has a whole presentation on this that I linked to from my URL, which you should totally check out. In this case, Chris Fairbanks, who's on the checkout team, had this huge performance win. We call this kind of graph that slopes down a Baumgartner, named after Felix Baumgartner, who hopped out of a hot air balloon a couple years ago. But we love seeing this kind of performance graph at Etsy. We want to see things go down and to the right. So again, as you design, ask yourself, how many asset requests am I creating? Can I find a way to slim down the number of assets that I'm loading? Are my images really large or not sprited? And can anything be replaced with CSS3? How can I be smart about weighing aesthetics and performance, especially when it comes to heavy assets like fonts? And what can I repurpose so it's cache for the user or helps with devitis and the size of my markup? A couple last things. An additional recommendation I have is to include performance in any project documentation you have in the beginning. So set a total page weight limit goal, or set a total page load time goal, and hold yourself to it. Maybe you want to make some sacrifices that allow for a prettier page, more font weights, for example. You can say, yeah, we're okay with this because we can find some savings elsewhere because we set up this goal up front. It allows you to continue to play with the balance of aesthetics and page speed as you go. I also recommend you get your designs into the browser as soon as humanly possible. Photoshop is an unrealistic way of gauging how fast your site is going to be when it's in the browser. So you can start to see how large your page weight is and start to make concessions appropriately. Lastly, continue to iterate on existing designs with performance in mind. If you want to make some aesthetic decisions that negatively impact performance, do it. Just measure it, A/B test it, and see if those aesthetic decisions positively impact engagement at a point where it's okay, you could take that hit on performance. As Brad Frost says, good performance is good design, and there's a ton of other improvements that you can make on the back end, but 80 to 90% of the end user experience happens on the front end. On mobile, it can be up to 97%. So optimize for good performance, and you'll have a huge leg up on creating an excellent user experience. There's lots more. I've got 5 copies of the first 3 chapters of my book on all of this stuff in the back that I'm happy to give out. But also, this is a discount code just for you all. It's 40% off the print book, but it's a pre-order because I'm still writing it. And it's 50% off the early release of the book, which you'll get all of the PDFs even as I continue to write it. So please feel free to check this out. Thank you. And I love questions on this stuff, so please. I'm happy to talk now, but I'm also happy to talk after this. I'm going to eat pizza, though, because I haven't eaten yet. Yes? So the question was whether it's better to link to a piece of jQuery code rather than have it on the page, even if it's just a little bit. It really depends on the code. So jQuery as a library, if you're loading it from the jQuery website, it's probably cached in your user's browser. It's probably not going to be that much to go and fetch it. So that can be awesome. If it's just like a little piece of code, maybe it'll be better just on your site. It really depends on the thing. That's why I recommend testing it, like doing it, testing it, and see what the end page result is, because it can really vary for your users. The other thing I want to mention too is web page test is good for synthetic testing results, so it'll tell you how your page loads by an automated fashion. But if you can gather real user monitoring data, so something like Google Analytics will tell you how fast your pages actually load, and you could test the before and after of a change like this and see what impact it really had for your users. More questions? Yes? Oh, so the question was about hybrid apps. Do I have any thoughts on that? I don't have, no, just kidding. So we at Etsy don't have many web views in our apps. We have the checkout flow as web views in our apps. And so whenever we make a change to performance, we have to watch it, but we haven't trained our developers well on this at all. So I think that hybrid apps are awesome as long as the development team is prepared for making those kinds of decisions and measuring them. Yes? So the question's about environmentalist, this is green data. So we do a couple of other things at Etsy regarding, well, we actually do a ton of things regarding green data. Specifically when it comes to performance, we haven't measured it, but we do have a mobile device lab that we built internally. It houses about 34 devices, and we measure the energy output of this using what's called a modlet. Have you heard of this? They're super cool. They plug into the wall, and they actually measure all the energy consumption that gets plugged into it. So we've measured it that way. We've considered running tests that measure cell signal strength as an indicator on performance. So how hard is it for my device to go and fetch, or to go and connect to a cell tower, and then return data in our app? And how often can we sync that, and how much of an effect does that have on greenness? We have yet to do that, but it's something we're super interested in. More questions? All right, I'm happy to talk after. Thank you guys so much for having me.